Hey everyone, this is Jay Stein, and this is the Dynasty Investor series on the Devery YouTube channel. And today we're going to look at value at the running back position. And this corresponds with an article I have out on the Football Guys called the Dynasty Investor Running Back Value. And that's hopefully linked below, so please go check it out. We're going to look at a bunch of charts today on the running back position, broken up into clusters, and talk about different buys and sells. And some of the key points up front is I think it's a little risky, but I think we should be buying DeAndre Swift at cost. That makes a lot of sense to me. If you are cheap, if you're looking for cheap short-term fantasy production, I'm looking to buy Alvin Kamara, even with the potential legal issues that he has facing him. And although Damian Pierce has come off quite a bit in terms of price, he still looks a little expensive to me, and I'm actively trying to sell him. We're going to talk about that and much, much more. Let's get to work. Yeah, so thank you so much for watching again and welcome back. So to recap the process here, the way we measure value at the Dynasty Investor is by looking at a player's keep trade cut versus his fantasy points per game in a ratio called the price to earnings ratio, or PE ratio. So it's basically KTC divided by points per game divided by 10. And then you compare each player's PE ratio to a like-for-like cluster of players from an age, production, and potential perspective. And players in the same cluster should trade similarly from a valuation perspective. So they should trade around the same PE. And if they aren't, there's an arbitrage opportunity that exists to create value for yourself here. And KeepTradeCut, of course, KTC, that's a website that uses outsourcing by asking people that visit their site whether they'd keep, trade, or cut certain players, and they have an algorithm to come up with the values. And then I use those values as my prices is basically my sentiment indicator for these players. So let's, without further ado, let's take a look at these charts. So I'm going to add them to the stream here. All right. So, this is the fantasy running back landscape broken up into clusters of similar players by age and points per game. So these are not rankings. They're groupings of like-for-like players. And I think this is an exciting way to look at the running back group. The clusters are graphed with increasing estimated 2023 points per game on the horizontal axis and decreasing age. So the youngest is on the top on the vertical axis. So the players are divided into clusters shown by the gray dashed lines on that chart by points per game of 18 plus, 16 to 18, 14 to 16, and 10 to 14. And then by age of less than 25, 25 to 26, and then 27 plus. So visually, you can see the clusters are grouped by color, like dark black, gray, then light gray, dark blue, light blue, and then even lighter blue. Also, the size of the bubble represents each player's KTC. The bigger the bubble, the higher the KTC. And I wanted to give a big shout out to at NFL_Billy_Jones for helping me put this chart together on the running backs. And he also helped me do that for the quarterbacks as well. So I'm going to hit the next slide here. So this chart is another chart here. It also looks at graphs KTC versus estimated 2023 points per game. We added a best fit line, and I think this is a fascinating chart. I think it might indicate that players above the line are maybe a little expensive on a KTC versus points per game basis, and those above the line are a little cheap. It's sort of like a very crude measure, but we're going to look at clusters next. So that's the real meat of this conversation. But I just think it's pretty interesting. You can see some pretty decent outliers. Like look how far Kamara is down below the line. Look how far down James Conner is below the line. Look how far above the line is Bijan Robinson. And this doesn't necessarily mean anything. I'm not saying that is particularly the case that any of those guys are overvalued or undervalued, but it's just sort of interesting to look at all those guys on one chart looking like that. So for what we're going to do is we're going to break these different clusters up, and we're going to look at these clusters from a graph perspective of KTC over time. So here's your first graph. This cluster is age less than 27, and it's 18 plus fantasy points per game. The players in the cluster are Bijan Robinson, Breece Hall, and Jonathan Taylor. As a reminder, these charts graph the cluster's individual KTC prices over time. 3 years ago, Jonathan Taylor's KTC was around 7,500. It went down, it went up, but his KTC took off during the 2021 season where he attained a maximum of 10,000 KTC towards the end of the 2021 season and briefly into the offseason. So for a few months, Taylor was one of the highest priced assets in Superflex formats as a running back. In this day and age, that is quite the feat. He spent most of the offseason around 8,500 KTC and then had a disappointing 2022 season, and his price fell to around 6,000 KTC. It's sort of incredible, the swings in KTC, even though for a large portion of this time he was RB1 the whole time on KTC. So from a rankings perspective, he was always RB1, but his KTC price fluctuated quite a bit and moved around wildly. Brees's starting point was a bit lower. He was drafted to the Jets, and maybe there was a little bit more uncertainty with him, or just that the running back positional value was declining over time. But his price starts around 5,500. He has a great start to a season. His KTC skyrockets, but then he's injured, and his KTC falls back down in line with Jonathan Taylor. And finally, we have Bijan Robinson, one of the better running back prospects we've seen in a while. He debuts on the KTC around 6,600. Then he's drafted early in the first round to the Atlanta Falcons, and he pushes his way up above 7,500 KTC level. But as you've seen with Taylor in this chart and a few others we'll look at soon, Robinson's upside could still be relatively high, even though you can't get much higher from a rankings perspective than already being RB1 of the group. He can still increase in value relative to other position groups, i.e. wide receiver and quarterback. So, there's still potential upside there for Bijan to get to those levels that Jonathan Taylor reached, and some of these other guys we'll look at in the future reached. Breece Hall, I'd say he's a buy if he wasn't already the second highest priced running back on KTC. To me, he's more of a hold, but you got to be patient with him. He might not get it turned on until the back half of the season as he works his way back from his ACL injury. And Jonathan Taylor, I'm still a believer. He's a true differentiator at running back, even though 2022 didn't really meet those expectations. I do think we have to watch out for first round quarterback Anthony Richardson taking more of the rushing share, and probably will have some more of the team's rushing touchdowns. So I'm not sure that 22.2 points per game season he had in 2021 is on the table. However, getting back above 18 plus fantasy points per game this year will go a long way to support that valuation. So I think he looks a little bit undervalued in this group, and so I'd want to be a little bit overweight Taylor going into the 2023 season. So here, let's look at the next cluster, going to the bottom right-hand cluster. These guys also put up differentiated fantasy points per game. The cluster I have here is age 27 plus and 18 plus fantasy points per game. In this case, we know that some of these guys score quite a bit more than 18 fantasy points per game. There may be no magic age cliff number for running backs of the caliber of McCaffrey, but 27 is probably getting a little close. That said, Derrick Henry, now 29, turning 30 next January, is still putting up pretty differentiated fantasy points per game. So McCaffrey, was hanging out around at a KTC max of around 10,000 here. We're going to look at this chart here, or slightly below that for a while, for a long time. But he fell substantially through the 2021 season, and then baseline between 5,500 and 6,500 KTC from there. Eckler and Henry's 3-year pass are fairly similar. They both continue to put up differentiated points per game, but their value decreases as they age. Although they both look cheap on a PE basis, both these guys will likely continue to lose KTC value as they age, and will most likely put up outstanding points per game until they don't, and then their value will probably evaporate. So it would be best to only look at these guys from a short-term perspective. Although McCaffrey just now crossing the line, I think maybe should be treated slightly different than the other two. But I do think he's on watch now for Father Time to catch up. That said, McCaffrey is an easy win now buy. He helps your fantasy team more than earning KTC price appreciation. That's kind of what I'm looking for. So you won't get back what you pay for him right now. But he might help you win your fantasy championship. And as McCaffrey is just now crossing line, I think the most reasonable valuation is, the way I did it, was a 5% discount to the Bijan, Breece, Jonathan Taylor cluster. And if you look at it that way, McCaffrey does look a little bit undervalued for the type of points per game differentiation he does offer. So this season in 2023, I do want to be a little bit overweight McCaffrey, looking specifically at this cluster. So the next cluster is, I got these circled here. So it's the top blue ones here, and this is aged less than 25. at 16 to 18 fantasy points per game. And in this cluster, we're looking at Jahmyr Gibbs, Travis Etienne, Ken Walker, Javonte Williams, and DeAndre Swift. So let's start with DeAndre Swift on this one. Swift achieves the highest KTC of this group over the past 3 years, oscillating between 6,000 and 8,000 for 2 years. Then he had a disappointing 2022 season with the Lions, where he fell out of favor, which led the Lions led to the Lions drafting a replacement in Jahmyr Gibbs and shipping Swift off to the Eagles. Now Swift is trading at the lowest KTC, lower than the rest of this cluster. Next, we'll pair Travis Etienne and Javonte Williams together, as they were both drafted in 2021, where Etienne is injured before the season starts, and his KTC plunges. All the while, Williams goes on to some tremendous KTC appreciation through that first season. They spend 2022 offseason about 1,000 KTC apart, with Williams at 6,000, Etienne at 5,000. And then Williams is injured, and you can see his KTC plunge to where Etienne was. And then Etienne starts healing up, and he gets on the field, and he shoots up to where Javonte used to trade around 6,000. So now they are trading about 1,000 KTC apart again, with Etienne on top this time, and Williams at the bottom. If Williams can get back healthy, I do think there is some upside there, but there's ifs related to getting back healthy. Jahmyr Gibbs, I actually think I might be the one of the few analysts that is a little bit lower on Gibbs than consensus. Yes, I get that he's a tremendous pass catching back, and he gets outstanding draft capital. And yes, I do think the Lions will use him early and often. But I am not sure he proved in college that he was a great runner of the football between the tackles, with poor rush yards over expected metric. And because of this, I think he'll probably be limited to that 16, 17 points per game range, not that 18 plus points per game cluster. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it. It's a little bit different. And if you take it from that perspective, he does look a little expensive. I'm not saying to sell Jahmyr Gibbs by any means. I'm just saying I want to be a little bit underweight his exposure. I still do want some shares just to be safe, though. So we're going to look at a couple of charts here. The first one, I've talked a lot about this process. I want to show you one of the trades that worked. We recently upgraded Ken Walker a month ago. I actually first recommended selling Ken Walker in November, on November 8th in 2022. That's that first black circle there that you can see, kind of really close to a high point. His KTC at that time was 6,780, and at that time he was the Dynasty, or the KTC RB1 from a rankings perspective. At that time, I put a KTC price target of 5,150, and then when we did the upgrade, his KTC was around 5,384, which was within 5% of where my target price was for him. So it came right back down to where I'd hoped it would, and at that point, I upgraded him from a sell to a hold. And so the total trade was a favorable 21% result, or an additional 1,400 KTC added to the process. And that second black circle, that's where I upgraded him from a sell to a hold. So now I think he's about fairly valued, not exactly fairly valued. You can see on the very right-hand side of this chart, you can see when the draft happened, that quick jot down, that was the draft. That was so on 4/26, the day before the draft, Walker's KTC was 5,691, and then in the second round, the Seahawks draft Zach Charbonnet, and after selecting Charbonnet, Walker's KTC fell, and he put in a low on May 16th at 5,076 KTC. So just the NFL draft, he lost 11% of his KTC value just on that NFL draft. So I just wanted to show you Ken Walker's chart, because this is an example of the process working and what kind of signs we're looking for. And when a player gets that far up, that far high, there's probably going to be some reversion coming back down, and this is exactly the type of result we were looking for here on Ken Walker. The next chart here is DeAndre Swift. I mentioned at the beginning we upgraded DeAndre Swift with this new Dynasty Investor series. Swift does look like the buy of this cluster. So we added him to the top pick list. We're actively trying to acquire him for the 2023 season. His price target, based on all the work that we did, is around 4,800 KTC, which represents 20% upside. This is a very depressing chart. It looks depressing. But if you take a look at the -1 standard deviation line here, which is 5250-ish, My price target is 4,800. So I'm not even advocating that he gets back to his average line. All I'm advocating is for this 20% move here for DeAndre Swift. Um, so I don't think we're doing anything heroic here. If he puts up that 16 plus fantasy points per game, which is in the realm of possibility, he's done it before. I think there's further upside to the price target. I think he can get into the 5,000s, and maybe even to that average line at 6,200. But that's I think what we're going to roll with is that easy price target. I think of 4,800 KTC. That 20% upside from current levels. And so, I got that buy on DeAndre Swift. I do think it is risky, but I think there is upside for a 2023 season. Somebody I want to be overweight this season at cost. And so now we're going to move on to this next cluster. This next cluster is age 25 to 26 that scores 16 to 18 fantasy points per game. And we're looking at Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs, Najee Harris, Tony Pollard, and Ramondre Stevenson. So this chart to me is really interesting in that these guys are all very spread out on the left side of the chart and the graph, and then very tight on the right side of the chart. Very, very close on the KTC currently right now. So Saquon Barkley starts at the top as one of the most valuable running backs available and finishes at the top of this cluster. The only only Najee Harris could surmount Barkley at any point in this chart. And that happened after Najee's rookie season when Barkley was injured. Josh Jacobs was on a epic fall in KTC from around 8,000 to just over 3,000 until last season, where he put up some huge numbers and got a boost back up to the 5,000s. Tony Pollard has played committee back and second fiddle to Ezekiel Elliott on the Cowboys for a few years, but last year that flipped and Pollard became the guy, and his KTC shot up from 3,000 to 5,000. If you notice, we talked about Jacobs, we talked about Tony Pollard here going from 3,000 to 5,000s. That's basically essentially what I'm calling for DeAndre Swift to do. So it's definitely possible. We've seen that a couple of guys last season where they got on the field and they start producing, they can get back up, gain a couple thousand KTC points there. And that's sort of what I'm advocating for DeAndre Swift. Just a side note there. Ramondre Stevenson comes from basically irrelevance off the chart to have a couple good seasons, especially in 2022. And now he's right up there with the rest of these guys. So he also has the opportunity to own that Patriots backfield. So it's an interesting play there. Ramondre Stevenson, especially being at the very bottom of this cluster. Saquon Barkley, I gave him a 15% premium multiple to this cluster, called the Saquon premium. Even though he's the same age and scores the same amount of points as these guys, I think there's still that premium that you got to pay for Saquon Barkley. If you plug in that premium, I do think he's a little bit undervalued for this group, and I do want to be a little bit overweight Barkley this season. Tony Pollard, after years of everybody saying Pollard's more efficient than Ezekiel Elliott from all those numbers guys, we finally saw it, and Pollard is undoubtedly more efficient, and I'd like to see what the Cowboys bring in, if they bring in a veteran, possibly even Elliott back to complement Pollard. Otherwise, if they don't, it's the incredibly efficient Pollard getting all the volume, and we'll see what he can do from that perspective. But that could be huge if it does work out. There does seem to be a little bit of evaluation upside with Pollard if that type of situation does happen. However, that's just a projection right now because we haven't seen it happen before. And so this next cluster here is age 27 plus, 16 to 18 fantasy points per game. And we're looking at Nick Chubb, Aaron Jones, Joe Mixon, Dalvin Cook, and Alvin Kamara on this chart. Can anyone say age cliff? This is a good representation of how value can decrease substantially as running backs age over that 27 years old, even though they're still producing points per game at a pretty good clip. So for various reasons, Nick Chubb is holding his value better than this cluster, as there's a gap between his KTC and the rest of the group on the far right-hand side of the chart. The rest of the group is tightly grouped on KTC today. In addition to Chubb right now, Alvin Kamara, Dalvin Cook, and Joe Mixon have all spent time at the top of this cluster from a KTC perspective. So these guys have, all oscillated to some of them being at the top of the group. But their prices have been pushed down for various reasons. Kamara and Mixon are dealing with legal issues, and there is uncertainty in Cook's team situation for next year. So Nick Chubb, like he continues to have fantastic points per game seasons, and he had one again last year. He's one of the best in the league at running the ball, but he may always be a part of that committee where he doesn't get the pass catching upside. So we'll see what happens this year. He does look a little bit overvalued relative to this cluster, right? So these guys produce similar points per game and are of similar age. So like there is something to be said about maybe being a little bit underweight Nick Chubb this year, but I still do want shares to be safe. The value in this group, I think, is Alvin Kamara. That is another name in the Dynasty Investor Series that we upgraded just recently. Yes, he's facing legal troubles, and yes, he likely misses time this year. But all running backs can miss time due to injury, all different types of situation. What Kamara does provide you with is when he's on the field, he produces significant points per game, especially relative to the cheap prices that it would take to acquire him at the moment. Recently drafted running back Kendre Miller is a fresh face there, but Kamara has never had a problem putting up differentiated fantasy points while sharing a backfield. Think Mark Ingram, Latavius Murray, and he's able to put those differentiated fantasy points up even in those situations. So my price target on Kamara is 3,800, which is 25% upside from current levels. Again, like Swift, 3,800 price target doesn't even get you back up to the -1 standard deviation line. So there's nothing heroic here. He just needs to get on the field and we can, capture that bounce. And he's also going to put up those differentiated points per game. So he also will help your team win from that perspective. So let's look at the next cluster here, the top red ones here. This is age less than 25 and 14 to 16 fantasy points per game. And of course, we're talking about Dameon Pierce, J.K. Dobbins, Zach Charbonnet, Rashad White, Devon Achane, Cam Akers, and Isaiah Pacheco. And this cluster is really kind of the cast of characters here. We have newcomers in Zach Charbonnet and Devon Achane, who show up at the very end of this chart, and you can see call out the bump in Achane's KTC after the draft, a fairly favorable situation for him. Then you have second-year guys in Dameon Pierce, Rashad White, and Isaiah Pacheco, who actually start pretty far apart from each other at the start of their charts, but are now pretty close from a KTC perspective. And finally, the injury guys in J.K. Dobbins and Cam Akers, who are both very highly regarded, but their prices have taken huge hits as they work their way back from significant injuries. So the one I wanted to talk about on this one is Dameon Pierce. I downgraded Dameon Pierce. You can see on that black circle in September of 2022, and at that time his KTC was around 4,400, and I put a target price of 3,600 on him. Using the cluster valuations, I'd say I should consider probably a 4,000 KTC price target for him. I think that's probably reasonable, but I think I'm going to stick with that original 3,600 price target. And objectively, Pierce was a winner from the draft in that I thought the Texans would add a running back to the mix that would place or force Pierce into the committee, but that didn't happen. But it's still possible. These are dynasty bets. They're long-term bets. Replacement is still possible next year or through free agency. So I'm advocating that Pierce gets down to his average line, that red dash line of around 3,600. That's his price target, and some decent downside there from that perspective. Trades wise, it makes a lot of sense to sell Dameon Pierce for. Right now, you can sell Dameon Pierce for DeAndre Swift and a 2024 third, so you could collect that extra third. I'm trying to buy DeAndre Swift. If you wanted to, also you could also sell Dameon Pierce to buy Alvin Kamara. One of the other recommends you can get a second on top of that. So you sell Dameon Pierce, you get Kamara plus a 2024 second. Those are the types of trades I'm looking for. You can sell Dameon Pierce for that 2024 first, a random 2024 first. That would be interesting to me, in the chance that 2024 turns into something more significant than what Dameon Pierce is. I also be interested in swapping Pierce out for DJ Moore or Deontay Johnson plus a third for the same price of Dameon Pierce. So those are all types of trades that I'd be looking to continue selling on Dameon Pierce. The final cluster that we're going to talk about here is age 25 to 26, 14 to 16 fantasy points per game. This is Miles Sanders and David Montgomery. They're both playing for new teams this year. Sanders started at a much higher level, fell pretty hard over the last couple of years, and then had a bounce back season last year before moving from the Eagles to the Panthers. And Montgomery has a reasonably level pricing environment for his career. And this year he looks to split time with first round pick Jahmyr Gibbs for the Lions. You guys know my feelings on Gibbs. We talked about it a little bit earlier. I do think Montgomery gets a little bit more share than what people are expecting. I think he's going to be a bigger part of the running game than the Jahmyr Gibbs stands. The Jahmyr Gibbs truthers are probably thinking at this point. This chart, I just wanted to include, these are the top 5 rookie running backs on KTC. We could go down to the rest of the running backs, but you got to stop somewhere. So I just took the top 5 here. And then what I really wanted to show was the price movement that happened around the draft. And you can see around that 430 line there in the a little bit right to the middle of the chart where there is actually moves. And you can see Bijan going up. You can see Jahmyr Gibbs going up. You actually see Zach Charbonnet fall substantially, and then Devin Achane increasing substantially, and Kendra Millie increasing substantially there. So Devin Achane kind of meets up with Zach Charbonnet, even though Charbs was a clear number 3. Now it's not quite sure who that third running back in this group is, given that Charbonnet, Achane, and Miller are all kind of sort of grouped pretty tightly on the far right hand side of the chart. And then lastly, I don't have much conviction on these guys. They still may all get a decent opportunity to increase their points per game this season, and they need it because currently they're pricing in substantial upside right now, and that's this middle green chart that's between the 25 and 26, and we got Khalil Herbert in there, Alexander Madison, AJ Dillon. Those guys, they have the potential this year to kind of, have the opportunity to put up points per game, but they really need that because they're all sort of pricing in that valuation. I'll just mention real quick, the very bottom left part of the chart. Those are the very, very cheap guys. I'll even include James Conner. He's the very bottom red dot there. And these are the guys that are, get at that age cliff, and the value is significantly low. These are not guys that we're buying, but there is tremendous value in picking them up, and hopefully they earn you some fantasy points per game. But you definitely don't want to be, trying to acquire them. You kind of want to get them at values, and hopefully they help you put up some points per game. So that's it. Go check the article out. I know we've talked about a ton of different charts here. Go check the article out on Football Guys for a much more in-depth discussion and some more data on these guys. Please like, comment, and subscribe down below. And if you're not already, please join up on the Deverell Patreon. You can find me on Twitter @_Jason Stein. And thank you again so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And see you again next time.